Hey everyone, and welcome to a new episode of He's Not Wrong. I'm your host, Chad D, and today I'm joined by Mazin Sidahmed, the co-executive director of Documented, an independent nonprofit newsroom dedicated to reporting with and for immigrant communities in New York City. Documented isn't just covering immigration, they're producing original responsive reporting and providing actionable resource guides in English, Chinese, Spanish, and Haitian Creole, making sure that critical information reaches people in the languages they actually speak. Their model is community-driven journalism. They're a nonprofit, meaning that they don't report on immigrant communities only, they report with them. The goal is simple but powerful: expand access to news and information that helps immigrants in New York and across the country thrive. They meet people where they are: WeChat, Signal, Nextdoor, Facebook, you name it. Documented is there for their audience. Mazin brings a global and deeply grounded perspective to this work. He previously worked at The Guardian US during the 2016 election, covering surveillance, criminal justice, and the rise in hate crimes that followed. He later joined the award-winning Guardian Mobile Innovation Lab, developing new mobile-first storytelling formats. He began his career at the Daily Star in Beirut, reporting on the Syrian refugee crisis, weapons transfers to Lebanon, and migrant domestic workers. After moving to the United States, he contributed to Politico New York, covering real estate, the New York City Housing Authority, and city police. Our conversation today is about immigration, media trust, community-based reporting, and what it looks like when journalism is built to serve the people most impacted by the stories that are being told. And without any further ado, I give you my conversation with Mazin. Welcome to He's Not Wrong. I'm so excited to have you on today. This conversation is very timely with everything that is going on in the news, specifically with things that are happening in Minnesota. Just in the past few weeks, we've seen the killings of Alex Preddy and Renee Good. ICE is on the streets in Minnesota. They're coming after the immigrant community of the state. And it's really shocking what we're seeing there. What I want you to help walk me through is why everyone across the country should be paying attention to Minnesota and why it's concerning, not just for the people in Minnesota and Minneapolis, but why we should all be concerned in our local communities across the country.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the show, Chad. It's really great to be here. And obviously, what's been happening across the country right now is deeply concerning for us here in New York and for people around the country and across the world. People are really watching what's happening in Minneapolis. What we're seeing in Minneapolis really is an extension of a narrative war that the Trump administration is waging against immigrant communities and really trying to galvanize their base and advance their agenda. So the events in Minneapolis really started after a viral video from a YouTube influencer called Nick Shirley, who was focused on the Somali community in Minnesota and a benefit scandal that had happened there. And the Trump administration latched onto that and saw how the online discourse was really focused on that issue, especially amongst their supporters, and deployed the government resources that they had to really double down and keep the focus and attention on the issues that they really want to keep the focus and attention on. So following that video, they deployed these federal immigration agents. And as you can see, the spectacle is as important as the arrests themselves. So
Mhm.
the CBP commander, who's really responsible for a lot of these federal deployments that we've seen across the country, Greg Bovino, he travels with a camera team that records every single thing that he's doing. And that's really to keep the focus and attention on the issues that they really want to focus on. So that really helps them in two main ways. Number one, it galvanizes their supporters, make sure that they're owning the conversation, that they're driving the conversation and the narrative. And number two, it incites fear in immigrant communities across the country. So even if your city hasn't experienced one of these federal deployments, immigrant communities are so afraid of what might happen to them. Is your city going to be next? Are there going to be roving raids in my community? and people start to adjust their actions based on that. So it really helps the Trump administration's agenda on many levels. And it's the tactics are things that we've never seen before in this
Yeah.
country.
I've talked about that on the specifically that on the podcast before, how the Trump administration and the right wing politicians, they deploy these very extreme right wing influencers to go into these cities, for instance, to Portland, to film certain ICE agents stoking fear within the community. And then so you have these video clips where there might be a few people on a street who are loud and to their base might seem obnoxious, but what they're doing is actually peacefully protesting in their community, and they use those clips to justify unrest. So then Trump can then send more people into those cities to justify him putting military on our streets. One thing that I find really disturbing is the fact that they do that. That is their model. We have seen it in multiple cities across the US within the past year. But then you have Don Lemon and other local journalists in Minneapolis who are covering the protests, like when the church service was disrupted, and then they're getting arrested. What does that say to independent journalists and news outlets like Documented that cover things that might not paint Trump in a good light when this is the example that we're seeing play out?
Yeah, the arrests of Don Lemon and Georgia Fort were incredibly troubling and petrifying for a lot of journalists. And I think for many Americans, it was really a amping up of some of Trump's strategies and something that journalists and media organizations and other publishers that we're in community with were worried about in
Yeah.
advance of the incoming Trump administration. So I think the goal of arresting people like Don Lemon and Georgia Fort is part of a broader strategy to simultaneously undermine the public's trust in the media ecosystem, while also, as you said, incite fear in individual journalists. So authoritarians around the world use this tactic. The goal is really to create a sense that any media organization that is not publishing things that the administration likes is not trustworthy. So the administration said that Don Lemon and Georgia Fort were working with these left-wing agitators, that there's a broader conspiracy, that you can't trust these institutions, that you really need to focus on the real news that's coming out from the influencers and the news outlets that the Trump administration trusts. And we see that with the elevating of right-wing media outlets in the White House press briefings and the ways in which they're trying to elevate certain types of media and punish and undermine the public trust in other types of media. And what that does is it changes people's perceptions of what is real news and the types of media that they should use to inform themselves about issues like immigration. And then on the second layer, as you said, it's supposed to have a chilling effect on journalists like myself who are going out, reporting on the news, questioning whether or not you should actually report on that story today. In our newsroom, we're almost exclusively writing about issues that the Trump administration would not want us writing
Yeah.
about. And the idea is to basically make us second guess every time that we do that. But I will say that that part of the strategy is not working. We signed on to a letter with a number of other news organizations in the US, led by one of our colleagues here in New York, a newsroom called The City, that condemned the arrests of Don Lemon and Georgia Fort. And I really feel that the whole media ecosystem has really been galvanized by this, and I don't think the chilling effect is working.
Does it change your approach to how y'all are telling stories or gathering information? Is there anything that y'all are doing to prepare for possible attacks from the administration for the stories that y'all write about?
I'd say it's twofold. I think that on the one hand, it galvanizes journalists and really crystallizes the importance of the work,
Mm,
but also there is a necessity to take different precautions.
yeah.
So, a lot of people get into this work for moments like this. This is why the importance of journalism becomes so evident and clear in times like this. Fact-based information. We see it in Minneapolis today. There's just incredible work happening from local journalists in Minneapolis. There's a great newsroom there called Sahan Journal that's focused on immigrant communities, specifically founded by a Somali journalist named Mukhtar Ibrahim, that's really built for this type of a moment. So in a lot of ways, it's actually invigorating and pushing our newsroom. But simultaneously, we do have to take precautions. A lot of our journalists are not citizens, they're facing their own personal attacks. So we are taking digital security measures. We're really blessed actually to have an incredible pro bono First Amendment legal community in the US, the
Yeah.
Reporters Committee for Press Freedom, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and they've been helping us really think about digital security and all the different ways in which the Trump administration might target news organizations, nonprofit organizations, we're a nonprofit, all the different levers that they might pull. We're planning for all of those things, and we're trying to make sure that we're keeping everything buttoned up, so to speak.
Local and state officials in Minnesota filed a lawsuit trying to halt this ICE surge that they're seeing in the state. And a federal judge denied that restraining order. But yet, despite one judge kind of controlling that narrative and denying that restraining order and allowing ICE to continue what they're doing in the state, thousands, tens of thousands of people have protested in Minneapolis. We've seen protests across the country, despite what the judicial system is upholding coming out of the Trump administration right now. What do these nationwide protests tell us about the public sentiment on immigration enforcement right now?
Yeah, I think that you could only have to look at the polling to see that the tactic is not working in the way that the Trump administration had initially hoped. So I think there's a few things to say on your comment. I think on the one hand, definitely, I think that there is a huge growing unrest around the tactic of deploying federal immigration agents, arresting U.S. citizens, killing U.S. citizens. All of these tactics are not having the intended impact that I think the Trump administration wanted. And then on the other point, how useful are the courts in this moment? So I think on the first tactic, we've seen one of the only climb downs from the Trump administration on immigration a few weeks ago when Trump actually reassigned Greg Bovino and indicated that he wanted to reduce the
Yeah.
number of agents in Minneapolis. Now, whether or not that's going to happen, there's mixed reports about the actual scale of reduction that's happened there. But the trigger for that was really that Trump was seeing that the way these actions were playing on Fox News was not favorable to his base. So it goes back to my earlier point that really the narrative battle is the most important thing for the Trump administration. If he feels that on Fox News, people are upset with the ways in which the Trump administration is carrying out its agenda, that is really what triggers a lot of his pushback. And I think the protest and the reaction have really helped move that narrative. And I think that the importance of protests right now is seen because during the first Trump administrations, one of the main sources of friction in enacting their immigration agenda was the courts. The courts were really a place where a lot of different immigration policies were stopped or slowed down. A lot of the things Trump tried to do on the border, the cancellation of a lot of different immigration statuses were held up by the courts, oftentimes on administrative grounds. And as you just mentioned, the courts have not been as favorable in this administration. So street protests and also Congress seem to be the only other places where folks who are trying to stop the president or, push back against their immigration agenda are the main levers that people can pull in this moment.
It seems like there's so many areas that we can't rely on in our democracy right now to stop what it is that we're seeing. But a few of the things that I think are very effective are our ability to still practice free speech despite what's happening to independent journalists. We still have a right to free speech. We still have a right to protest. And we're seeing both of those being effective and moving the needle some. And that's why the work that you're doing is so important for the immigration community in New York with Documented by creating this community-based newsroom that serves that community specifically. What gap did you see with traditional news outlets that caused you to say, hey, this is something that we need to implement for our citizens and for our community?
Yeah, so Documented was born actually at the height of the family separation crisis during the first Trump administration. It feels like many lifetimes ago at this point. But really, my co-founder, Max Siegelbaum, and I, we both had careers covering immigration, and we saw a real hole in the national coverage in that it was focused mainly on what was going on in DC and what was going on in the border, but nobody was covering how these huge policy shifts were playing out locally in big cities like New York. And one of the main reasons for that is that local news has been decimated across the country over the last 20 years. Local newspapers have been shuttering, news outlets, all different types of local news have been really collapsing. And that often means that the types of reporters that could really cover these issues, these complicated Byzantine issues like immigration, were no longer working there. So we thought there was a real hole and a need for covering immigration at the local level. But in addition to that, we felt that a lot of immigration coverage is often about immigrant communities, but never for immigrant communities.
Yeah.
I previously was a reporter in Lebanon, and I would go to the border with Syria. There was a Syrian refugee crisis at the time, and I would spend the whole day with somebody, hearing this heart-wrenching story about how they traveled from Syria, left their home to come to this new place. And I'd go to my office in Beirut and I'd write a story in English that that person would never read or engage with. And that relationship often felt extractive to me. So we wanted to create a site that was covering immigration issues, but was actually doing it for immigrant communities. So we built Documented to do that. And today we publish the news in English, Spanish, Chinese, and Haitian Creole. And we distribute the news via WhatsApp, WeChat, and we actually use a Nextdoor account as well.
That is so fascinating to me, recognizing that you have to find people where they are, and that's where you need to meet them. You can't just rely on the mainstream outlets to provide the information that people need and expect that that's where they're going to go. And you have said that published news is often not for immigrant communities. And what I'm curious about is how the approach with documented changes how you report and how you source stories and the way that you distribute that information. You talked about the distribution a bit, but what about the actual reporting and sourcing of information and how that's framed?
So we employ a community-led a community-led journalism model in how we reach immigrant communities. So, most journalism, the way I was trained to do journalism at journalism school, the way I did journalism, and most of the news outlets that I worked at previously is very top down. You as a journalist, you know what's best, you know what's newsworthy. But at Documented, we actually try and let the community lead us on what they think is most
Mm.
important and focus on the issues that they care about the most. And the way that we do that is we actually go out and we listen. We talk to people and try and understand what their needs are. So a few months after we launched Documented, we did what you call an information needs assessment. This is an approach that is created by a group called the Listening Post Collective, where we went out to Spanish speaking undocumented immigrants here in New York, and we asked them, what do you think of the existing media ecosystem? Where do you get your news? How do you feel about the way you're portrayed in the news? What would you actually like to see from a newsroom? And they came back to us with three main findings that really drove the way that we produced the news moving forward. First of all, people felt that whenever they're in the news, they're either portrayed as a victim or a criminal. There's no nuance in the ways
Mm.
in which the communities are covered. Second of all, people wanted actionable information about how to navigate all of these resources and programs that were supposed to be helping them, were often really complicated and hard to understand. And finally, most people got their news from WhatsApp. So if you're anyone who's not from the US, or maybe some people in the US as well, you know that most people are getting their information on WhatsApp. They're in a WhatsApp group with their church group. It could be a WhatsApp group with parents at your high school, or just a block group, or people you play soccer with on the weekend. That's actually where people were getting their information and their news about what was going on in their community. So in 2019, we launched a weekly newsletter called Documented Seminal. It's roundup of news and information in Spanish that we felt would be useful to Spanish-speaking immigrants here in New York. And over the past few years, it's really grown and flourished into this engine of our newsroom. So we have a dedicated community correspondent, Romel, who spends about a third of his day just replying to people on WhatsApp, hearing questions from people, sending out the newsletter. He takes those questions into the editorial meeting and says, "Hey, a lot of people this week are worried about, how can I get heating in my house? Or, what's going on with the snow in our community? Or, most pressing, what's happening with ICE enforcement? Should I go to my immigration court hearing?" And he takes those questions, and then that drives the types of stories that we publish that week or the issues that we investigate that week to really build relationships with people. And we employed the same model for the Chinese immigrant community and Caribbean immigrants here in New York as well.
What's the biggest challenge that you face in sustaining this new model?
I think the main challenge really in this moment is building a new business model for news. So as I said, over the
Mm,
past 20 years, the economics of journalism have really collapsed. So we
yeah.
had, decades of advertising-based news where, newspapers could rely on a steady stream of revenue from advertising, and that really collapsed a few decades ago. And we've just been in a constant state of disruption because of that. But we picked this non-profit model where, because our readers are often low-wage immigrants who are struggling to put food on the table for themselves, we rely on donations from foundations and individuals to really support in creating the news and funding our newsroom. News gathering is really expensive. Going out, fact checking the news, actually having reporters at a protest and making sure that they're safe, making sure that everything that they're reporting is accurate is really expensive. And building a news organization that does that takes a lot of resources. So we're really trying to build this new model of nonprofit news, which has been incredible. We're actually part of a movement across the country of folks, oftentimes journalists like me and Max, who were laid off from their local newspaper, who decided to start their own nonprofit newsroom. And we're seeing that growing throughout the country. While at the same time, there's this collapse of media in a
Mm.
lot of other different sectors of our industry. The nonprofit news media has been, a small, bright light in all of that.
I'm curious about how you measure the success in the work that you're doing. Because right now, even in that collapse of that traditional media ecosystem, the pulling of advertising dollars, it's all fragmented. There still seems to be a level of measuring their success based on clicks and based on views and advertising dollars. So with that being the way they measure success, not on the impact of a story, but rather on the monetary value of a story, how do y'all measure success? How do you look at something and go, yeah, that had an impact and we need to do more of that?
That's such a great question, and it's a big, big conversation in our industry right now. So we really think about impact on a few different levels. So first, there's the systematic level, the issues that are coming up from our community. Can we report on stories that actually have a broader systematic impact on that? So we focus on an issue like wage theft. In 2019, just at the peak of ICE arrests, we were hearing from a lot of people in our community that their wages were getting stolen, that there were different employers who were using the current situation or the situation during the first Trump administration to take advantage of low-wage workers and not pay them. So we really focused on doing a lot of investigative journalism. We built a database of all of the state's wage thieves to really highlight how prevalent this problem was and help workers know which employers they should avoid. And that led to a series of legislation being passed in the state assembly level and just a broader conversation around the issue of wage theft here in New York State. So that's how we think about systematic change of the community needs of that our community is relaying to us. And then we think about it on the individual level. So a lot of times we're sharing resources, guides, helping people navigate New York City. We had a lot of people coming to New York when the the governor in Texas was busing migrants to New York City. People were arriving in the city. They didn't know how to navigate the city. They were trying to find housing. They were trying to find access to English classes, all of those different things. We were able to provide information to help them navigate that. Right now, we get so many questions about, should I go to my immigration court hearing?
Mm.
Can I still get access to SNAP benefits currently? If we can provide information that's helpful to people and somebody sends us a note that says, this information really helped me and my family in this moment, that's incredibly powerful for us. So we really value that individual impact. And then we're trying to change the conversation around the media as a whole. I think that's really important for us. We've seen a huge shift in how the media is working. We've seen a huge shift in how the media is structured over the past few years. And really, we're trying to help people understand what you just outlined, which is that we can't rely on those old metrics. But finally, I will say that it's important to have an audience. The reason that the Trump administration has been so successful is that a lot of these influencers and folks that are driving the discourse in our country have huge audiences. So it is still important for us to try and build audiences to make sure that our work is resonating with people, but we have to think about doing that in a different way.
One thing that I admire about what you're doing, as we talked about, is going to where these immigrant communities are, and that's in these untraditional media spaces and sharing information with them. And I had a guest on last month, and she was talking about using those same spaces, but using it for collective action in mobilizing your community. So there's a lot of immigrant communities in Alabama who might not feel safe going to get their groceries. So you can use WeChat or you can use Signal, you can use Nextdoor to say, hey, I'm going to go do a grocery run. Does anyone need anything, need groceries? I'll bring it to you so you don't have to go outside because they're fearing for their lives right now. They don't want to leave their home. So it's just so amazing to me hearing the different touch points of these sites that can be used to spread information, to mobilize a community, to help one another. And it's just, I mean, it just is fascinating and mind blowing the work that y'all have done and the good that's being used in these spaces.
I appreciate that. And I do think that's the future of how people are going to get information and mobilize. I do think that these broad-based platforms, a lot of people are moving away from them, feeling that the discourse on there is not reflective of what they want to be speaking about, feeling somewhat disconnected from their local communities. And I can see a future in which a lot more newsrooms are approaching distributing information in this way. And as you said, a lot more organizations that want to organize people in their communities, connect with people in their communities, are utilizing these smaller, closed platforms to really build that. I think the pandemic and the mutual aid movement that really grew out of that in New York specifically often utilizes a lot of these small WhatsApp groups to organize people and get people together. And we're seeing that now a lot with the Ice Watch groups in New York as well, that a lot of the local ice watches in New York are organized on these very closed, small spaces.
We talked a little bit about the fractured media landscape right now, and the way it used to work is there were just several main news outlets and channels, and everyone listened to all of them. But now we have such a fractured media landscape where people really don't go outside of their narrow lane, and that's the only information that they're getting. And oftentimes, the news and information about immigrant communities and what's going on with ICE is very distorted, and that's the only information that people are getting. So I want to ask you about how we combat those falsehoods and those inaccurate reports and the narrow mindsets that people might have based on the information that they're only getting. How do we reach new people? How do we share truth with how fast things are going right now and how fast
I
information
really,
spread?
it's a really big problem, and I really think that building trust is really the key solution to that. Um, what you described is exactly the situation that we're living in. So almost everybody is living in an individual reality. A lot of people have never been to Minneapolis. They've never step foot in there, and their entire understanding of what is happening in Minneapolis is shaped by their Instagram feed, their TikTok feed, whatever it might be. And everybody's feed looks slightly different. So
Yeah.
everybody is living in a very individualized reality that, as you said, sometimes a lot of the things that they're seeing are not grounded in truth. So we've lost that shared reality and that shared basis of facts. And that has so many consequences for our democracy and the discourse in our country. And I think the way to combat that and what we're trying to do at Documented is identify the people that we want to reach and build real, meaningful trust by consistently showing up, understanding what they care about, understanding the needs that they have. So Romel, for instance, on WhatsApp, people know him by his name. They don't know him as an institution. This is documented, giving you this information. This is Romel. He gets a good morning meme on WhatsApp. You know, those kind of
Yeah.
interactive pictures with a little coffee cup. People send him messages about their birthdays, and then they'll send him something being like, "Can you fact check this for me? My uncle just shared this in our WhatsApp group, and I don't know if it's true." So people start to build trust with individuals that they feel are really have their best interest at heart. And I think if we can continue to do that and build on that and really start from a place of listening, understanding what people's needs are, and then building news and information environments that are responsive to those needs, we can build civic infrastructure in our local cities that I think can really help combat this. There's a group called News Futures that Documented is a part of that's really trying to reimagine news as civic infrastructure, that it's a core part of what you need for a healthy, vibrant city. And if we can start to build local institutions that have real relationships, we can start to get people grounded again in what's going on in their local communities, what's actually happening in their local communities, and less tied to the national discourse and seeing everything in their local community
Mm.
through the lens of this broader
Yep.
national conversation that they're seeing on YouTube, TikTok, Fox News, wherever it might be.
I always talk about that on this podcast is the need for community and local engagement and involvement. If we can start viewing things through a lens of our local community and as our neighbors, I feel like we could really change and shape how things are operated. But what I'm wondering now is, does Documented collaborate with mainstream outlets in sharing immigrant-centered stories?
Absolutely. We work with a range of different national publications. We've partnered with New York Magazine, we've partnered with WNYC and other outlets to really amplify the work that we're doing and places where they can provide resources that maybe we don't have to help elevate the issues that immigrant communities care about and keep the spotlight on this issue specifically. And, you know, we've been covering this issue for a long time, even when immigration is not in the news, we're still covering it consistently. And
Yeah.
we want to make sure that that spotlight remains on the issue and the issues that communities that we serve care about are receiving that focus. But in addition to that, we also distribute our own email newsletter in English and publish stories on our site that are really focused on reaching an audience that care about immigrant communities. So there's a lot of New Yorkers who are engaged, who care about these issues, who aren't from those communities necessarily. And we want to make sure that they have information about what's happening, being a bridge and helping them understand, as you said, the issues and the lives and the things that immigrant communities are going through. And then they can also be mobilized to create that systematic change that I was talking about earlier.
I feel like systematic change is the only thing that's going to really be the answer to what my next question is. But I'm curious because I want to know what worries you about the way that misinformation right now is interacting with and informing our government and our politics, because it seems like right now they have their finger on the pulse of misinformation, and they see that people are interacting with and letting misinformation be what guides them and guides what their policies and what their politics are, and then they see that grows fear, and then that's what they act on, and that worries me. and it's going to take systematic change to put an end to that. But I want to know what worries you most about that coming from your journalism field.
Yeah, I think that what we are seeing is that the right wing influencer kind of network that exists online was
Yeah.
probably a few years ahead of the traditional journalism industry, and we're playing catch up right
Mm.
now. So I think that a lot of the folks, Nick Shirley, others, people that work directly with the Trump administration had a better understanding of how people were consuming information and the type of information and the type of news and the type of packaging that does really well online. So for a long time, I think Ben Shapiro on the right and Tucker Carlson have spoken about the fact that there really was never a strong, rigorous, fact-based publication on the right that was really focused on doing journalism in the way that a lot of the kind of traditional media was operating
Yeah.
at that time. But it turns out that a lot of the more opinionated, personality-driven approach actually does really well on the internet. And that people don't really want to tune in to institutions on the internet. They want to tune in to individuals and they want to tune in to content that is much more opinion-driven and less so done through the lens that traditional media operates in. And they were much more savvy about creating completely native to YouTube, completely native to Facebook publications before when Facebook was really driving the conversation, completely native to all these different platforms, than I think a lot of the traditional media was. So when we're thinking about audiences and news consumers, I think that ecosystem was just ahead of its time and has really built huge audiences and has tapped into something that a lot of people really resonate with, and I think helped drive Trump's rise over the last decade. And now in our industry, there's a lot of conversation from traditional journalists and news outlets, even nonprofit news outlets who are created by people like Max and myself, my co-founder Max and myself, who come with traditional news values, news gathering, fact checking, making sure that everything is correct
Yeah.
and upheld to a certain standard and produced and delivered in a certain way. We're now in this game of trying to play catch up with the existing online ecosystem of influencers and others. So I think that delta between the two things, it really does concern me. But what we're trying to do at Documented, whereby we actually build relationships with communities, distribute news and meet people where they are, get news and information to people that is useful and actionable in their day-to-day lives. I think that model is starting to be adopted by other newsrooms across the country. People often reach out to us to try and understand how they can better reach immigrant communities in their local markets. And we've started training newsrooms on how to do that. I think that gives me a lot of hope.
Speaking to the playing the catch up right now compared to the infrastructure that the far right has put into place, what will it take for all of us to help organizations like yours get 2 to 3 steps ahead? What does that future plan look like?
I think it's really about tapping in, finding the local news organizations that you have in your local community. As I said, there's this incredible movement right now of nonprofit newsrooms across the US. You can find one, I'm sure, wherever you live. You can find a local newsroom that is doing incredible work. So really subscribing, watching, helping those organizations build the audiences and really get the traction that I think a lot of these right-wing influencers have. But I do think there's also a question, a broader question about regulation from the platforms. I think a
Yeah.
lot of these major tech platforms have allowed these things to fester on their platforms with very little accountability from the government. And
Yep.
a lot of the information that is spreading on these platforms is really dangerous and harmful for a lot of communities and for the country as a whole. And they've faced close to no accountability for their role in this. So I think there does need to be a broader conversation about what role the tech platforms are playing. And I
Yeah.
think that is something that I'd love to see folks focus on over the next few years.
I definitely think that with the events of the last few weeks, there's a lot of people that have woken up to the need for regulations on those platforms, especially with the purchase of TikTok and who owns it, and Larry Ellison buying all these media corporate. Like feel like people are waking up to this idea that billionaires should not own our media infrastructure, because even if we have the freedom to say what it is that we want or post what it is that we feel like people need to know, it's still being filtered or censored. And I feel like there is a sense of people waking up to the idea that regulation on these social media platforms, I should say, is a good thing, and it will help everyone. But one thing that I really appreciate about Documented is the fact that y'all are just ingrained in your community in New York. So you have insight and knowledge and an understanding of the needs of your community more so than a lot of other people would in the journalism field. So knowing what it is that your community is saying, having your finger on the pulse of your community, what are the top three concerns and questions that your newsroom is getting from the immigrant community right now?
It has been a really challenging year just being in the positionality that we have. And we also have a staff who's personally dealing with a lot of these issues
Yeah.
as well. You know, a lot of our staff are from the communities that they serve. So it has been a really challenging time. And I'd say the top three concerns would be ICE arrests,
Yep.
the number one concern. The second would be putting food on the table. And finally, somewhat connected, it's around jobs. So on ICE, we haven't faced the federal enforcement that a lot of other cities have faced. I think a lot of New Yorkers are bracing themselves for that to happen.
Yeah.
But despite that, there's been an almost 200% increase. We published a story last week on the data. There's been an almost 200% increase in ICE arrests in New York City. These are targeted arrests that are happening in different communities, and people are seeing ICE patrolling in their neighborhoods more than they've ever seen them before. And that obviously has so many other chilling effects. Like you mentioned earlier, people are afraid to go out and do groceries. People are afraid to take their kids to school. We've seen arrests at schools. There was a high school student arrested last year, and a drop in attendance at a number of different schools in immigrant neighborhoods. And generally, it's causing a lot of panic in the community. One of the main tactics that ICE deployed last year was arresting people at their immigration court hearing. So this was a tactic that was spread throughout the country, but New York was one of the main places that was affected by it. So a number of the questions we were getting is, should I go to my immigration court hearing? What happens if I move my court hearing online? What are the consequences of that? And like many journalists across the country, we're facing a constantly evolving situation where one thing you publish one day might be invalid by the time it
Yep.
goes out the next day. So it's constantly trying to stay up to date on these different issues. On putting food on the table, we got a number of questions on our WeChat account from the Chinese immigrant community here about SNAP benefits. People are concerned about the new public charge relation to SNAP benefits and the working requirement to get SNAP. And people are not sure if they're still eligible. A lot of New
Mm.
Yorkers rely on SNAP to put food on the table, and they're not sure if these benefits are still going to be around for them. And a number of other programs have been affected. And people are trying to find work. It's a really complex environment where there's a lot of fear, and people are really struggling to find work in the current environment. So those are the main things that we're really seeing from the community every week.
We've covered a lot. And before we wrap our conversation, like I said, we covered a lot from breaking news and immigration, nuances of community journalism, the battle against misinformation. It's a lot to digest, but I want to leave our listeners with concrete ways that they can, number one, get involved, and number two, stay informed. I feel like it's really easy to fall for that sensational rage bait social media content and to stew on that all day long. But at the end of the day, we have to be able to mobilize. We need to take action, and we needed to get involved. So what ways should we be getting involved and staying informed to make sure that we move the needle? What are the concrete actions that the listeners need to take?
I think we're really blessed in New York and I think across the country to have so many incredible organizations that serve immigrant communities, and they really need a lot of help in this moment. So things like you mentioned, going to get groceries for somebody who can't leave their house, walking a kid to school, whatever it might be. There are so many different needs right now that could be really transformative for somebody just to feel that there are other people who care and that the current environment is not reflective of how their neighbors feel about them. So finding the local immigrant serving organizations in your community and finding ways to tap into them is a great way to get involved. And staying informed, as I said, really being grounded in the local issues in your community. There are definitely amazing newsrooms where you're at. There is a website called Find Your Newsroom where you can put in where you live and you can find what nonprofit newsroom exists in your local community and support them either just by reading, subscribing to their newsletter, whatever they have, and donating as well. A lot of these organizations are nonprofits and they really need those donations and support right now. At Documented, we have a early arrival newsletter that rounds up all that's happening with immigration. So please sign up for that, and find ways to support and go out and support your community.
Final question. What are you not wrong about?
What am I not wrong about? Can it be about anything?
If anything.
I am a sports fan. I'm a fan of Arsenal Football Club. They're on a charge to win the title, and I'm not wrong that we're going to win the title this year.
There you go. There you go. You know that. So are you're from? You're from England? I'm assuming.
Yes, yeah, I grew up in London. Yeah.
So that's just one thing, and I know it's like a stereotype when it comes to the football, soccer, the word change, but it's always so jarring when I hear someone from England refer to soccer as football. I'm like, what?
Oh my God, that's
Football?
hilarious.
I haven't
I have
heard
the
about them.
I have the exact opposite experience. It's like so jarring when someone still I've been here so long and I still can't get past it. But you're changing. I'm seeing a lot of Americans call it football now, which is nice to see.
Are you excited that the World Cup is coming to North America?
I am, yeah, I am. Obviously, that's another political quagmire as well to see what's been going on with are people even going to be able to show up for the World
Right?
Cup? Which is just truly I have no idea how that's going to play out. So many of the countries on the ban list. But yes, I've never been to a World Cup in my life. I've been a football fan since I was a child. So the opportunity to see a game is really exciting to me, but it is obviously a really, really
Yep.
complex topic.
I think one of the most powerful things that could happen, and it is so complex because it's like I want the World Cup to come. I know it's going to come. I just wish the administration was not who they are, obviously, at the time that it's coming to North America. And I think one of the most powerful things that a country could do, unfortunately, is to protest by not sending their team here. What more of a message could be sent to Trump and the administration if and all the money that they've spent to prepare for the World Cup and it's boycotted. Like I hate that for the soccer players, but at the same time I'm like if that's what needs to happen and that's the message that they need to hear then so be it.
There's huge, huge calls for that in Europe currently. So there's a lot of, especially after the Greenland situation, there's a
Yeah.
lot of countries in Europe who are saying that they absolutely should not go to this World Cup. And as I said, the issues in Minneapolis are global. They're
Mhm.
huge topics of discussion across the world right now. Everybody is watching very closely what is happening and are feeling outraged. So it's not impossible that there will be, for the first time in my lifetime at least, a boycott of the World Cup. I wouldn't completely write it off.
I think there's a lot of opportunities coming up in this next year that have the impact if we protest correctly and in the right way and in unison with one another. I mean, I really feel like a message could be sent with the 250th birthday for America being in
Right.
July and all the events surrounding that. You have the Olympics right now. The Olympics will be hosted in America in 2 years. I mean, the opportunity is ripe for protests and for people to use these moments to spread how unhappy we are with what's going on and how disgusting the administration is. But we'll see what happens. I can only hope. But I am so grateful for the work that you do, for your expertise, for your time today. This is such a fascinating conversation about community-based journalism and the ways that we can get involved and spread factual information in a model that's not focused on money, but that's focused on truth, doing what's right, and being there for one another.
I really appreciate that, and it's really meaningful to be here and to have a space like this to talk about this work. I think this is how a lot of people are staying informed as well, is through podcasts like this. So it's really great to see podcasts like this that's highlighting the work that we do and the work of others. So thanks a lot for having me on.
Absolutely. We're going to stay in contact. I would love to have you on again in the near future. So that this isn't goodbye for good. We'll be talking soon.
I appreciate it.